Hey everyone, we are going to be looking at this week in our reading plan the end of Ezekiel, the beginning of Daniel, and then Psalm 106. All right, so let's look just for a few moments at what we're going to find in the end of Ezekiel, then we'll look at the beginning of Daniel, and lastly we'll end with Psalm 106. So in Ezekiel, this week, we are going to be seeing the end of the prophecy from Ezekiel. What we've just seen in chapter 37 is where the valley of dry bones, God said he's going to bring to life, and he's going to build up this army for God's people. Now, 38 and 39, where we start this week, is going to highlight kind of the sovereignty of God over the nations. And then in 40 through 48, it's this vision of the new temple. Now, there's a lot of different arguments over exactly what this is talking about. I want to lay some of those aside and just kind of highlight some main things as we get into this section. First, let me just be honest that it's going to be hard sometimes maybe to read through this. It's going to be a lot of details and it might be a little bit confusing. And so I want you to have a certain set of lens on as you read this. I want you to read it in its current context, so Ezekiel writing this to the people, and just read about this new temple. But as you're doing that, I want you to think about the temple and the temple imagery, both past and future, what we know now of the New Testament. So as you think of the temple, think of the themes of the temple that we've already read so far this year in the Bible reading plan. But also, if you've read through the New Testament at all, consider what it means that Jesus is the new temple, or think about some of these themes that we're going to see in these chapters and how they are picked up in the New Testament. So let me give you a couple examples. Here's a few themes that we're going to see throughout this. Number one, I've already mentioned, the main thing is that this is the temple. And the temple is the place where God dwells with his people. So as you think about this new temple and the beauty of this temple, think back to what Israel has already experienced at the temple. Think about what a group of exiles would long for as they're reading Ezekiel's prophecy in the present. But also consider, how does the New Testament speak of the temple? And where does Ezekiel's prophecy fit into the New Testament idea of the temple? Also consider, in chapter 43, God's glory said he's going to indwell the temple. Now again, think past and future for this, okay? So think about in the early chapters of Ezekiel when God's glory left the temple and he left his people. Well, here it says his glory is going to re-engage. It's going to be back in with the temple and his people. But along with that, we see in the future that the temple, not only who is Jesus, but even in Revelation, it picks up this theme of God's presence being with his people. So consider that as you see the good news of God's presence being in his temple. Think about that, what that means for that being Jesus, but also in the end of Revelation when it talks about the new heavens and the new earth and we dwell with him. Lastly, another unique theme that I want you to highlight is the idea of water. That may sound weird, but just notice what happens with water in these chapters. Just a little spoiler, everywhere the river and the water flows, life comes out of it. Now, as you think about that, I want you to think about, how does Jesus in the New Testament talk about living water? Talk about these rivers of life. John picks up on this in his gospel. Revelation picks up on this throughout some of the prophecies. In fact, a lot of Revelation is going to pick up themes of Ezekiel 40 through 48. So if we want to understand the Gospels and we want to understand Revelation, we've got to know Ezekiel 40 through 48. There's a lot of debates over exactly what's going on here. Just my personal, what I've been persuaded to believe is that this really is pointing us to Revelation 21 and 22, the new heavens and the new earth, where God builds a whole new city and temple for his people. So read along, just see what you think about that, and let me know if you have any questions or thoughts on that. So that's the end of Ezekiel. Then we're going to shift to Daniel. Now, when we get into Daniel, the first 6 chapters are basically just a historical account of the life of Daniel. One thing that you should note, when you get to chapter 7, that's going to be a shift in genre. It's no longer historical, but now it's more apocalyptic writing, which we'll talk more about that next week, but we'll dip into that here in a second. But for the first section, 1 through 6, what I want you to consider is that Daniel is a man who's trying to be faithful to God in exile, which means he has a king that is not looking to serve and worship God. It means that he is in a place that is not pushing him to love God, but to abandon God for the gods of the nations. And the question of Daniel is, how do you stay faithful in worship to God while also being a faithful citizen of another society? Friends, could there be a more applicable question for us today? I mean, Daniel just speaks so well into our questions that we are asking of how do we stay faithful to God in a post-Christian culture where our leaders are not pushing us to faith in God. The culture and society around us is not pushing us to follow God's word. What does it look like to work well, to be good neighbors, and to be faithful while also worshiping God? That's the question of Daniel. So as you read through those chapters, just consider that. What does Daniel have to say to our moment? But then when you get to chapter 7, and we're not going to get into this too much this week, but chapter 7 begins to look forward, and it's what we call apocalyptic literature. Now, the one thing I want you to know about Daniel 7 is that you're going to see the phrase Son of Man and see this character Son of Man highlighted. I need you to spend a lot of time this week reading and thinking about the passage where it talks about the Son of Man, because that is one of the most often used phrases that Jesus uses for himself. And when he calls himself Son of Man in the Gospels, and we're going to see that over and over and over again, he is invoking imagery from Daniel 7. So in order to understand the Gospels, you've got to understand Daniel 7 and what it means that the Ancient of Days would give the Son of Man the kingdoms and power and glory. And what does that mean when Jesus later claims that he is the Son of Man? So consider that. Think about that. Maybe spend a decent amount of time just meditating on that, because that's going to be really helpful for you as we get into the Gospels. All right, so that's Ezekiel, Daniel. Lastly, we're in Psalm 106 all week, and I love Psalm 106 because it's what's called a historical psalm, which means it is a psalm calling the people of God to give thanks to God, but they do so because of specific things God has done in their past. So here's what I want you to do. Each time you read a section of the psalm, I want you to see, why is Israel giving thanks to God? And you'll see things like, we give thanks because God has shown us favor. He's given us grace. Or you'll see things that God is angry over the sin of the nations, and God has worked in those ways. When you read that, I want you to find the theme of that morning, of what he's done, and I want you to think about, how has God done this in my life? All right, take the historic psalm, not just for Israel, but make it your historic psalm and give thanks to God for what he has done in your life. All right, so that's Ezekiel, Daniel, and Psalm 106. I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions or thoughts, and we'll see you again next week.